Welcome to a special bonus episode of Mental Health Without Borders. Today, I'm honored to be joined once again by Hannah-Valeria Grishko, who many of you will remember from her earlier appearance on the podcast. Hannah-Valeria brings a rare and powerful perspective. She is both a therapist and a survivor who has lived through war in Ukraine and now in Israel. In this conversation, she opens her heart and expertise to help us understand what it really means to cope during wartime, the impact of trauma and displacement, and the unique challenges therapists face when supporting others in crisis, and the tools and strategies that can help us stay grounded in the midst of overwhelming fear, grief, and loss. This episode is deeply important, especially to me, and I hope that you will find encouragement, wisdom, and practical guidance in Hannah-Valeria's story. May it remind us of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of global solidarity in times of suffering. So thank you so much for coming on and welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here and to talk about a very important, very difficult, but very sensitive, but very difficult, but also really important and therapeutically very important topic. And hopefully this will be interesting to others and other therapists as well.
Yes, I have no doubt that it absolutely will be. And like I've told you before, I don't feel like a lot of people are talking about it. And so I think it's just a really important place to be right now to speak about some of these topics. And so to start, I know we already had you on the podcast and we talked a little bit about your journey. But for those listeners who didn't listen to the first episode, can you just give us a little bit of information about growing up, living in Ukraine, and then how you landed in Israel and are now practicing in Israel?
So I was born in Ukraine, in Kiev, Ukraine, in the capital of Ukraine. And my parents had left. I was 18 and a half when my parents had left to immigrate to the United States right at the beginning of the 90s. And so then I finished education, finished high school, finished my graduate degree and worked as a psychotherapist. I worked as a licensed psychotherapist in New York before I decided before I started my traveling journey when I lived in France, England for quite a few years. And now I practice in Israel. I haven't physically lived in Ukraine permanently since I was 16. So my experience with when the war in Ukraine started, I, and along with other Russian and Ukrainian speaking therapists in Israel, and certainly not the only project in the world, there are many others like this, but it was very much of a grassroots kind of instinct and desire and to kind of get together and to offer support, therapeutic support, supervision support to therapists and clients in Ukraine, or whether they're in Ukraine, whether they're in refugees in other European countries or in other countries in general. And then, of course, when 7th of October 2023 happened and massacre in Israel, then obviously this also required of me to continue to work with trauma and continue to work with a very, very serious and very significant impact of these traumatic events on others. So for me, it's been a very multi-layered story of collective trauma, of individual trauma, of how do you work with it. As a person, as a therapist, you see, it's very interesting because when Ukraine started and I started working with Ukrainians in Ukraine, I was still in a relatively safe place in the sense the bombs weren't falling on my head. And so I know I say this in a kind of very, very sort of blunt way because I want to delineate sort of these differences because, of course, looking from the outside, living life in Israel always looks like a war zone. I think many people around the world experience it like that, looking at the news. But in Ukraine, people were actively were living under bombs and occupation. So it was very different in that sense. So at that point, my experience of it was secondary trauma, it was collective trauma, but I wasn't there physically. Of course, when October 7th happened in Israel, then that shifted as well. And of course, that had an impact also on therapeutic relationships and what we call traumatic reality and things like that. So that's kind of my background in terms of where I'm coming from into this interview in terms as a person who's definitely grown up in Ukraine, felt very much that it was my home. Not always how people feel about where they grew up when they immigrate, but I did. And and having been through this journey of being in different places, living in different countries, in many ways, I think it's always to some degree, it's a search for self and a kind of a hero's journey in the way Joseph Campbell used to write about it. It was a search for self, for a search of greater consciousness or greater awareness and fuller sort of experience of life. And sometimes you can do that, obviously, living in the same place. You don't necessarily have to travel, but I think it adds a different dimension, I think, here. Very embodied dimension.
It really does. And you said the word multi-layered, and I think that's the absolute perfect word just for your experiences of growing up somewhere who's experiencing wartime now, and then where you're experiencing it where you live in a completely different way. And so I think, that, yes, there's a lot of layers there. And then, of course, when you add on being a therapist, helping people, and then having family and friends all over. So, of course, there's so many layers for you. And so, what has it been like for you, both personally and professionally, to live through these two wars and to experience these two wars, first in Ukraine and now in Israel?
Well, if I said it's quite painful, I would say that's probably understatement, but I would say words are quite limiting. It of course, has been very, very painful, and has been very painful really since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. In many ways, I should say the war in Ukraine, to be fair, the war in Ukraine really did start in 2014 when annexation of Crimea and then invasion to the eastern part of Ukraine. But the full-scale invasion that started in 2022, that's what I refer to as a kind of war, but it's not technically correct. It's been very painful because it's not only an attack on your memories, it's not only an attack on your friendships or relationships that you have had, that I've had and still have now, but it's also an existential threat. And of course, for Ukrainians and Ukraine as a country. And of course, as a Jewish person, you recognize it very quickly. It was very hard to watch that happen. I am reminded of someone, of a Holocaust survivor that spoken at the German Bundestag at some point, I think last year or 2 years ago, I don't remember the date, but I mean, what he had said, I think, encapsulates really how I felt and how I feel when he said, Hitler tried to kill me because I was a Jew, and now Putin wants to kill me because I'm Ukrainian. So please help us. So I think speaks to that level of pain, of awareness of this absolutely horrible, horrifying, and horrible reality that's taking place, and that a sense that there isn't really that sense of helplessness. And I think that hopelessness is sometimes people can feel when they're faced with war, that you seem to feel so powerless in the enormity of it all. And then, of course, when October 7th happened in Israel, I don't think there is any more kind of a more concrete reawakening of the Holocaust trauma than that. And those of the audience who know a little bit about Ukraine, they will recognize that my last name is Ukrainian, and I also have Jewish part to my life. And so I'm very much have connections to both. And so that makes it even harder. And of course, you see, it's very interesting because the therapist, it's like if we learn to be reflective, we learn to be observant, right? We learn to be observant of ourselves, of the clients, of their process. And so almost like you learn to be observant of your own traumatic response, which is helpful because hopefully you're not going to project them as much on your clients. But it's also like you realize it's very humbling. You're a human being, just like your clients, and you also can feel traumatized. And how do you live with that? And how do you cope with that? Or what do you do to help yourself so that you can still be helpful to other people? Again, I want to say it's a very multi-layered. Again, because on one hand, you're a therapist, you are trained, right? I've been a therapist for over 20 years, so I worked with trauma. But now it's on one hand, you are called to help, and you presumably know how to help. And I felt like I could help, but at the same time, it's very difficult. And sometimes you don't always know exactly how to help. Because, for example, I can give you an example. When the war in Ukraine started, I'm sure therapists in the audience will relate to this. We've learned how to work with trauma when usually our clients have been through traumatic experience. And now they're no longer in a traumatic experience, usually, minus certain situations when there's domestic violence or things like that. And now you're working with something from a safe place. Well, you can forget about that. In this situation, there's no safe place. It's just there's the degrees of safety and unsafe and lack of safety.
Think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like just we're not even getting past the safe zone. So how do we get to level? How are we getting to self-improvement? How are we focusing on other things? That's been my biggest kind of internal question throughout this. And thinking about people like you is just, you're 100% right that a lot of times when we're helping people cope with a trauma, it's past the trauma. And now we're trying to help people cope with the trauma that's current and ongoing without an end in sight. And so that's a different level of trauma therapy that I personally I've never experienced. So,
Right, absolutely. And sometimes you don't know. And that's the other thing. You don't always know exactly what would be most helpful. And you do your best and you try your best. And I can give you an example. When the war in Ukraine started, we had put together, as I mentioned already, there was a project of a therapist that wanted to help. And I remember I had put our names forward and somebody contacted me from Ukraine and said, well, how can you help? And I said, I can do lectures, I can do a supervision group. They said, great, let's do a supervision group. And there it was. I'm used to generally be the supervisor. I tend to like and run kind of like closed supervision groups where somebody joins and they stay And it's a closed group. People just don't drop in and out to create safety and capacity to really reflect, because when people drop in and out, it's a little bit different. But I was caught up thinking, is this what's most helpful? As you say, there's a hierarchy of needs. Maybe what's most helpful to people now is to be able to come to some group where they can just vent, where they can just talk about what happened. And maybe that isn't what they need. And I've heard many colleagues who do this work as I did kind of talk about it. You almost had to figure it out a little bit. You had to test the waters because there were no protocols. There may be some, but very few. How do you help people when they're therapists and they're in a war zone, for example? What is the most helpful, And so this is what happened. I started that group, and then it evolved from being a drop-in open group to now a closed group, because it emerged over time that actually people did need a safe space, as safe of a space as possible somewhere in this world where they can come to. So, but there's no certainty, and there's now all of a sudden things are a little bit less shaky and less comfortable and less certain. I think as therapists who work with clients who are impacted by war and also then are themselves impacted, we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
We do, because they are, right? I mean, they are. And so if we are as therapists, then that will help them as well. The only thing I can even relate it to in my professional life is going through COVID, where I was trying to help people cope in COVID, where same thing, I didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know what was going to happen. And we're just trying to do what we can in the day-to-day and focus on what we can control in front of us. That's literally the only thing I feel like I can relate to in this scenario. And it's nowhere near what we're talking about now, that lives were being lost. And there was just information out there that was quite confusing and you couldn't quite follow along with what was happening. And so I think just that's the only thing I can relate to, and just trying to help people get through their day-to-day somehow with some kind of other focus. But you're absolutely right. I think it's so important for people to also, to the opposite, have a place to go. This is where I go to vent. This is where I go to talk about it. This is my safe place where I don't have to worry about what I'm saying, how I'm saying it. I'm just kind of getting it out and being able to have somebody else carry it with me in a way. And so for you, how has being both a therapist and a survivor currently shaped your understanding of trauma and healing?
It's a very interesting question, because when you ask me this question, I'm thinking about, on one hand, how has it helped? How does it shape, right? I like how you phrased it, because how has it helped? Has it not helped? What impact did it have? And I think that's like to think about it in these terms. One thing I realized is that you do recognize trauma earlier. It's very interesting, because I feel sometimes as therapists, because we are trained to work with trauma, we do recognize it earlier. And if we have some awareness of our own story and have done some work around that story, then it makes it easier in some ways to recognize trauma early and to take care of yourself and to take care and help to take care of others. So there is some very important, I think, piece there, in that we are in a special position, I think, because of that. Sometimes it can be much harder. I think I mentioned this earlier. I want to say this again here, is that as a Jewish person who has worked quite a bit in my own story and the story of my family in the Holocaust, it was very obvious to me quite a long time ago what Putin's words meant and what he talked about destruction of Ukraine, and Ukraine is not a nation in its own. I knew from many years ago this does not sound like a very good direction. And so when the war began, it was very painful for me to recognize that this is happening. But I've also noticed to my clients, it's taken them a while, and even some of my colleagues, to actually recognize what they were going through and what they were facing. So it can really help in that sense, I suppose, being able to know these things. And of course, we have an opportunity to help. I think that's very special in many ways. But of course, there's the other side to it, the sense that, do you always know how to help? Can you do enough? Can you help? Yes, you can, but can you do enough? Because I think so many of us, and I think I'm included in that 100%, sometimes that are not doing enough. And there's also that survivor's guilt. I think sometimes that many people feel who are experiencing this level of trauma, that you survived, or you have something, or your conditions of life are better than others at this moment. And there's nothing falling in my head. It is in Ukraine, or it is somewhere else in Israel, or right this moment. Often it's very hard. It's very hard you have to process that all the time. You constantly have to soothe yourself around it, But I think also being a therapist, and I think has also shaped this understanding of healing and trauma and working through this experience, is that sometimes I have to remind myself that sometimes surviving and managing and going through your day is enough. If you have done what you could today and you have managed and you've survived, I don't mean only physical survival, I mean also psychologically, psychological survivor. That's more than enough. There's a quote by Viktor Frankl, famous psychiatrist and a Holocaust survivor. I'm sure many of our audience at least have heard of him. And this is interestingly a quote that a lot of my Ukrainian clients and colleagues were very attached to at the beginning of the war. But of course, when October 7th happened in Israel, it's something that's come back here. We all were reminded of this as well. And I think this really ties with what I want to say. And a loose translation of it is that he talks about obviously being in concentration camps. So there's a slightly different context to the quote, but I think the essence of it applies across the board when he says that first people who broke were people who hoped that this will end. And the other people, the next group of people who broke down, I think psychologically, were people who didn't think this would ever end. And the people who survived were people who were dealing with tasks that were in front of them day in and day out. Now, we're not in a concentration camp. In terms of tasks that are in front of us, there's a wider scope. But I think there's something very valuable, something very, very valuable in these words. So I'm reminded, I think, as a therapist, is that surviving in a trauma reality and managing and moving through your routine or your day or doing whatever it is that you're called to do, I think is enough. It's more than enough.
Yes, absolutely. I think you could be tempted to just stay in bed, to watch news for hours and hours at a time, to be stressed, to cower, to worry, and to do some of the tasks in front of you every day. That might be the only thing you can do, but to set out to do that and to accomplish it and say, you know what, I got through this day and we'll start fresh tomorrow. I'm a big morning person. I love waking up and going, you know what, the sun still rises the next day. So we need to rise with it and try to do what we can to make up the most out of that day. And so you're right. It is like, again, controlling what you can that's in front of you and kind of focusing on that. Because the bigger picture, it is overwhelming. And a lot of times it is out of our hands. And so that can make you feel like you're just in a tornado of a sense, just kind of floundering around. And so what can I grab hold of? What can I focus on? Like he said, like right in front of me, or what he said, the tasks at hand. And if I can focus on the tasks at hand, I can get through that.
Yes. And I think it's something that I've heard from other spiritual leaders as well. I mean, Franco is a psychologist, but I've heard this echoed in different spiritual traditions as well. Is that, if you're faced with something, you're facing something, or something comes to you, and you're uniquely placed. The Bhavata Rebbe said this, but as I said, I've heard this in other traditions, and you're uniquely placed to know how to help. Well, then the universe has left it for you. I derive a lot of sense of meaning. There's a lot of meaning in it for me, that if I'm a therapist, and I'm a trauma therapist, and I have, worked with loss. I've worked with loss for many years, and as well as trauma. And here's the situation, and I speak these languages, and I have this cultural understanding of where I come from, and I live here in Israel. So it doesn't look like to me that I'm placed to help. So I derive a lot of psychological support from that is my mission somehow.
And that's why I have so much respect for you, is because you realize that, like, I have a unique story, I have a unique position, I have unique gifting. So therefore, I really need to use it to help other people. That's really powerful.
Thank you.
And so kind of shifting to some of the things that you would recommend, what are some of the first common emotional or psychological responses you're seeing amongst people? This is something I've just been personally curious about. Just what are the responses, both in Ukraine and Israel, or just based on your own experience right now as therapist?
You see, I think those responses, very interesting question. And it's interesting, it's very synchronistic. I was just reading an article earlier this week. It was based on Israel, but I think it very much, it really echoed from me in terms of my experience of working with Ukrainians as well, is that people who are a direct military, who live or experience more of the direct impact of the war. So they're closer to the war zone where there's active military attacks or interventions. And they tend to have more symptoms of PTSD versus people who are affected by war, but may not have experienced the same level of war, situations of war. So to answer your question, so I think what I'm trying to say, there's a range. So from people who experience full-on symptoms of PTSD, there's a higher suicide rate, a much higher suicide rate in Israel and in Ukraine as well. And symptoms also of depression, anxiety, associations, part of PTSD, obviously. I think also there are people who experience association and that might not everybody meets full criteria for PTSD as well, right? So you can have certain other symptoms, but not meet the full criteria for this for DSM. So I think a lot of people have a lot of sometimes flashbacks or dissociation, numbing, I would say numbness, that emotional numbness, because, your system, your psychological world, your system can no longer cope with this intense emotions. And so sometimes you see that as also as a very, we all know this is a very classic sort of trauma response, feelings of fatigue, indifference, feelings, difficulties with sleep, difficulties with eating, some substance abuse. Weed is very popular, as you can imagine, for that reason as well. And it really is really a range between psychological, what we describe psychological as the psychological distress, to full-on symptoms of PTSD and high rates of suicide. So it really does vary. And obviously, people who are in active war zone, that's even that much more exacerbated. Then again, we also must remember, as you mentioned, Maslow hierarchy, it's very important, because if people don't have enough basic, don't have food or shelter or water, then we're looking at a whole different picture altogether.
Absolutely. And so what therapeutic interventions have you found to be helpful or the most effective with clients impacted by war, displacement, or ongoing threat? You definitely talked about there's ranges. And so, of course, you're probably going to meet them obviously differently, with your modality based on what they're truly experiencing in the moment, whether it's vicarious trauma, whether it's direct, PTSD from experiences they have around them. But what are some of the therapeutic modalities that have been most helpful?
Yes, thank you for saying that, because it's a really important question, but it's also a very large question, because we could just do a podcast on that, right?
Yes.
Because somebody who is in more general psychological distress, who's having a hard time sleeping, is going to probably need a different interventions than somebody who is suicidal, who is having active suicidal ideations or have all the criteria for PTSD. So in that sense, it's interesting, because as therapists who is, even though I rely heavily on certain approaches such as nutritional training was in a more integrative approach consisting of psychodynamic and systemic and CBT. Over the last 20 years, I've learned many more things. I've learned in the Jungian approach and sun play and trauma-focused interventions such as EMDR and somatic experiencing. You have to constantly adjust and constantly think about what different people may need depending on their presentation. But if I were to make 2 points, I think important points in this conversation, rather than turning it to another 30 minutes of just on that, I think it's really important, and it's something I really wanted to say today, is that there's a difference, and I will put my hand and say I didn't realize this at the beginning. There's a difference between crisis intervention and trauma therapy. And we tend to think that it's the same thing often, because you have a crisis. Usually the crisis happens as a result of something dramatic, or especially in the context of war. I think it's fair to say that a crisis happens as a result of something rather devastating. It's not yet trauma treatment per se, because somebody may experience a crisis reaction, but they may not develop symptoms of PTSD at all. And so sometimes a stabilizing intervention for someone who is in crisis may actually, we know this from research, helps people. Sometimes it really diminishes chances that they may develop a PTSD, full-on PTSD symptoms. So what I want to say is, first, it's really important to distinguish the two. Is the person in crisis? Because this will require, I think, a different approach. And I do want to say I'm very grateful to Complex Trauma Institute in the UK that they did a course specific to crisis education and crisis stabilization, and that was very helpful. There are other interventions as well, right, to work with trauma. That could be ongoing trauma, that could be acute trauma, there's variations. But if I were to make a general statement, I think it's very important not only rely on talk therapy. I think this is very, very important. Talk therapy, I really do see enough. Now, starting from this point, there are many things we can say. There's, of course, very different somatic interventions. There's the EMDR. I really integrate elements of somatic experiencing in my work, because I do find it incredibly helpful. Even interventions that seem so simple, you sort of think that can't possibly be that helpful, but it is, because it takes the client to their body and it helps them process and release and work with the trauma from the embodied experience, which is where we live, which is where we are. As a sound play therapist, I will also add that working with images is very important and can be very helpful. Not everybody responds to it, and not everybody wants to do that. But for people who respond to it, it's very, very helpful, because, again, it has a connection to the body, because you make sound play, you touch the sand, you make images in the sand. It's very grounding just from that point of view alone. But it also allows an engagement from a much wider position, from a much wider sense. And there's a visual, there's symbolic, there is tactile, and it gives clients a sense of agency, because they can make an image. They can also destroy that image. They create a new image, So that's also been, people who come to my office also is something that has been very helpful. And also focusing also on psychological resources. Sometimes when people are in crisis, or they are in the trauma work where they're not yet able to, their level of distress, it's very important to help clients to lower their level of distress before you do really what we would call as therapists more in-depth trauma work. Because if they're constantly aroused, if their nervous system is constantly aroused, it's going to be very difficult for them to feel safe enough and a level of the nervous system in the body to do.
I imagine you probably need to do that almost in a lot of the sessions. I can imagine. I know I have people come here in high distress, and the very first thing that we do is just try to get them into more of a state of relaxation so that they feel more comfortable opening up, because it's hard even here to do the work if you're very, very stressed or intense. And so I can imagine that's similar. Probably a lot of mindfulness, a lot of breathing.
But sometimes even mindfulness, but this is what I've discovered also, what covered it in the full book, but it's been underlined by this working in this wartime, that sometimes even mindfulness is too hard at the beginning. Just being able to do kind of the 4 element exercises or the muscle relaxation exercise, or even, a safe place visualization exercise that's used in EMDR and in MC4 CBT protocol, that I made a mistake of calling it a safe place. And a few clients have told me that there is no safe place. So I had to change it to a pleasant place. Can there be a pleasant place? Okay, that opens it up a bit more. But so that just tells you how unsafe, profoundly unsafe people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so you've got to shift and pivot and make sure you're capturing the right language to make sure that people feel that.
I understand the concept and understand that for some people, both in Ukraine and Israel, a place where they grew up and where they live, it's destroyed, physically destroyed. Yeah. And just to think about that level of devastation.
And so then it would be safe. That's your home. Even if you don't live there anymore, but that's your home. I grew up in Ohio. I live here. But if something happened to my hometown, I would feel the same. There's the safety being removed for a place that I lived, for the people that live there. And so absolutely. So safety is very important. And of course, it's hard for anyone to feel that sense, even if they're in a safe place. Like you said, I might not be part of a war zone right now in Israel, but it's happening there as well. You have to really touch on the reality too. And so what about with you also? So how does vicarious trauma, as we've kind of talked, people in both places and spaces, and you're supporting both places and spaces. You hear a lot, you take in a lot from the people that you're working with. So how does vicarious trauma, or what does vicarious trauma look like for therapists that are working in war zones and with clients that are affected by war? What are some things that therapists experience?
I remember this question kind of made me recall a lecture I attended 2 years ago, I think, a year and a half ago, actually in Ukraine. It was a lecture on trauma, but also had a big component of vicarious trauma. And the lecturer talked about the fact that it's interesting because therapists, by definition, it's a very interesting situation because being a therapist draws people that tend to be more on the empathetic side. They tend to have more, and apparently I didn't read those articles, but I do think there's a quoted, and I do think there's a research on this, that therapists do, in general, statistically speaking, have more altruistic motives as they experience the world. So it's a group of people that's already sort of has its own predisposition for extra kind of that level of empathy that makes you more and more vulnerable to vicarious trauma. And so, I'm not for sure. I certainly see that in myself. It's very humbling to realize that this is also me. I'm not immune to this. And I see this so much in terms of my colleagues. And I think our colleagues talk about, for our audience, for vicarious trauma, it's the trauma that therapists or other bystanders or people who help that also can experience by being a witness or by being in a position where they help by, the trauma, even though they may not have necessarily experienced the original trauma itself. I mean, vicarious trauma there's a whole range of different symptoms that you can present with. There's that sense of compassion fatigue, there's a sense of burnout, there's physical symptoms. They can range from pains to insomnia to difficulties with eating. There's the cognitive symptoms, that sense of forgetfulness or difficulties concentrating and things like that. Negative worldview, lack of motivation, a feeling of hopelessness, like what am I trying to achieve here? Emotional distress, numbness, actually, that I mentioned earlier, right? So that can really be crossed. So that's the sense of what I talked about, the psychological distress, irritation, a sense of withdrawal. I think also a very important one, a sense of isolation. And that's something I know I have to really watch out for, because sometimes when you feel you've taken so much on, you're sort of thinking like, of going out or interacting with other people. It's like you've had enough. But actually, it's very important to be able not to isolate yourself. But I think this is really important. It's really an indicator for therapists when we're trying to isolate ourselves. I think sometimes it looks like kind of like behavioral avoidance. Relationships really suffer. I think also through vicarious trauma, that sense of irritation, not having patience, not being available to your partner in the same emotional, perhaps, way because you're already so full with everything. I think it can really vary. It's like you can hear there's a lot. I remember when I became aware of my own, that I tend to isolate myself. I remember thinking like, oh, this is a sign. It's understandable when you have a hard time sleeping, knowing that there's an, bomb attack in Kiev, or you were being woken up from a siren because you have to go to a shelter. So, okay, I can completely understand, that you're not going to sleep perhaps so well afterwards. But when I realized that this is what we call the observing ego, right? That's just the importance of being able to observe yourself and to notice, and also seek support, having your own therapy, I think it's really important to talk to colleagues, people who work with crisis and trauma, especially trauma of war trauma. I really want to underline it. It's very important to have professional space where you can talk about these things. This is what drove me to also offer supervision group in Ukraine from the very beginning, because I knew this is going to be really crucial, just to have a space where you can talk about. As I said, it's very humbling, but it's very real. But it's more intense, I would say, in this war situation than it would be in a more safe situation as a whole, where you may have, obviously, therapists, I think, we're always in danger of secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, because we do work with difficult stories and painful stories of our clients. In many ways, we are a very privileged position, but it's also very unique, but it also does have that image.
Absolutely. And so kind of recognizing the signs in yourself that you already know are there and that you're teaching clients about all the time. When you start recognizing them, you need to do something about it and start taking your own advice and wisdom, and probably reaching out to other people, not being afraid or ashamed to do that, and saying, I want to catch this early on because I'm starting to notice that I'm feeling this way, and being able to get the help that you need in your support. And so what about you personally? How do you make space for your own grief and overwhelm while you're continuing to help care for other people?
I think it's a very good question. I think it varies, I think, from different pieces sort of time, weeks to weeks and months. And, sometimes I really feel very passionate, but I think it's really important. Our own work is really important. So this is the time where having your own therapy, having your own supervision, having your own group supervision, I don't know, I find it personally very supportive to be able to talk to other therapists and to be able to talk to other like-minded people about what's happening. So that level of support, I think, is really important. So for me, I also need nature. I love nature and I need nature. And so just making time whenever you can. This is why when there was a war in Israel and Iran, where there was constant sirens and a very real threat, it was very difficult for me, especially this was really very difficult because this could have happened anytime. It's happened at night. And so, I didn't feel safe going to somewhere, to a place where there's nature, because there's no shelter there. And so that was very, very difficult. There was also no end in sight. I had no idea how long this was going to last. And that was very, very difficult for me. I would say also for me, breaks, just very big proponent of watching ourselves, watching our body, and watching how we feel. And sometimes therapists need breaks, and we may need more breaks than we think. So I try to take breaks and really just use the time to help my nervous system to calm down. It amazes me now when I go. I've just been to a conference in Holland, and I also was through Berlin to Germany. I remember thinking, when I was there, I'm thinking, is it really that quiet, or is it me? Because to me, I felt like it was so quiet. Everybody was so calm and so quiet. People talk. It's not a library, it's a country, and Berlin is a big city, but it felt so quiet. And I really wasn't sure. The reason I'm sharing it is because it goes to show, when you are in a war zone for a long time, or you're impacted by clients who are in a war zone, and where you also feel an emotional connection to, like I am with Ukraine, it's your nervous system really does get really quite dysregulated. For me, if I can, whenever I can, breaks is really, really important. And I will also say, this is a little bit about me personally, but I have my stand playroom. So, of course, I can also make fun tricks. And that's very helpful to me. It's very playful. It's really fun. Also, I always tend to have a sense of playfulness when it comes to sand playing, and it's very tactile. And I do make use of it sometimes.
Absolutely. It's so calming, isn't it? I have a small one in my room as well, and just kind of going back and forth in the sand. It's very, very calming. So I completely understand that. And so what do you think, if we kind of expand the conversation out, and thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for sharing just your own experience and just what you're going through and what you've experienced and how you're making your way through it, because it is personal, but it's also so important for people, I think, to realize and understand what therapists are going through as well. And so what do you wish that more therapists around the world understood about working with clients affected by war and displacement?
I wish a therapist around the world understood more about working with war and displacement, I think that the first thing that comes to me is that I really like people to understand that day-to-day life can feel like a survival. And sometimes it's very hard to understand that when we haven't experienced that. But it really can feel like a physical survival. And it is a physical survival. And then it's a psychological survival. Physical survival, you may be able to see. The psychological, you might not be able to immediately see, but it is. It's just relating to yourself. I remember when people would ask me, this was before the massacre on October 7th in Israel, and people would ask me, oh, how are you? Like the way that people around the world would ask, the way that most of our audience today probably would ask, oh, how are you? And I remember thinking, like, how am I? If I answer honestly, how am I? I'm alive. A lot of people looked at me like funny, and they would say, well, okay, some people joke and say, okay, tell us what we don't see. You see that you're alive. But you see, they thought it was a joke. Well, it wasn't, really wasn't, because I remember, and it was also coming from that survivor's guilt. I'm thinking, I'm alive. Some people aren't. I have food, and my house isn't destroyed, and nobody's actively trying to kill me. This was until October 7th. This is improvement to what people were, had I been in Kiev, that would not have been my reality. I also would like therapists really to know that facing death and loss, you have to be willing to work with that. You have to be willing to work with facing death and loss, because that's what people have experienced. That's what somebody they know have experienced. Whether that's physical, whether that's psychological, but it's the reality, and it's uncomfortable. I would like people, therapists around the world, to know that this, I'm sure they know, but to really face the fact that this is very uncomfortable. And unless you're willing to work with it, unless you're willing to get very uncomfortable, you might want to think about is sort of what. Because I know a lot of people want to help, or some people want to help, and sometimes, and it's always welcome, of course. But I also want therapists to really ask themselves, like, where it comes from, and are you ready to help? And I've seen this, and also both in Israel and Ukraine, where immediately people want to help, and it's wonderful if people want to help. But when we talk about being a therapist and working with people who have perhaps lived unimaginable, are you willing to face that with them? And it's okay. I think it's good for us to know our limits. It's good for therapists to know our limits, when we're comfortable with, where we're not comfortable with.
Yes, I think that's really, really important too, because I think so many times people say that they want to help, but it's because of something that they're feeling, and they want to help, but they may not be appropriately prepared to meet somebody where they are in their trauma.
Right. Sometimes we want to help because we also experience a survivor's guilt. We also feel some little guilty, even though it's very irrational, survivor's guilt, but it's very real. But if it is a compensation for that survivor's guilt, that may not always work, and that may not always be helpful to people. I would also like to just remind other therapists, I think we know this, but once you've been through that experience, we are going through that experience, having a routine and having meaningful activities as part of that routine can be really, really helpful. And so it may not be the time for depth-oriented psychotherapy. It may not be the time to explore your history of your patterns of relationships or whatever. It's not that it's not important, but it may not be the right time. And then mundane things can be very, very soothing. And sometimes focusing on that and being able to remember that they can be very structured, supportive. And of course, it really depends on the situation. If this person is a refugee, let's say United States or in Europe or wherever, and the therapist is trying to engage with them, is just to be able to remember that you have a person who has lived through war trauma, now that are also dealing with immigration and adjusting to a whole nother culture. And you have to start with, as you say, Maslow hierarchy. You start where you are, and it may be very different to where you are or where we are.
Yes, absolutely. And you have given, I was going to ask about practical tools and strategies. You've given a lot of them already as we've gone, which is so helpful. And one of the big benefits of this podcast episode is, so then what do we do? And so you've given a lot of strategies. Are there any other strategies you would like to talk about that you would use when a client would feel overwhelmed by fear, loss, or helplessness? So you've talked about routines. You've talked about doing what you can on a day-to-day. You've talked about collaboration and support. Are there others that you would use to be able to help clients?
Yeah, for sure. This is a very wide, I want to preface this by saying there are many, many interventions like the ones I will mention. So I'm not saying it has to be this one, but I want to orient people towards that general area. It doesn't have to be the specific ones, but although some of them have been researched and have been proven to be very helpful. But so I think breathing exercises are so obvious. They seem to be so easy, and yet they're so helpful. So helpful. Just the basic awareness of the breath, then to the exhale being longer than inhale to kind of calm down the nervous system, to bring a person. And sometimes I find it's really amazing that sometimes people can tolerate it for more than a couple of minutes because this is just too uncomfortable. They haven't been in their body for so long, and being in their body is so arousing. So a couple of minutes of that, it's already, to some people, is a lot. Grounding techniques, range of different grounding techniques, from putting their feet in the ground, counting, we know this, counting things in your room. I don't know, 5 things are red, 10 things are green, bringing your consciousness, bringing your body, bringing awareness to the room, holding something that has weight, being able to squeeze, there are many, many interventions like that. I've also learned a very helpful intervention that people can learn it quite easily. It's called an immediate stabilization procedure. It was developed, it's an offshoot from, it's based on EMDR protocol, but it helps somebody who has been through a crisis episode, through a traumatic episode. They have just run to the shelter. They have just been under a bomb attack. They just come out of the house. The house collapsed in front of their eyes. And it's based on bilateral stimulation. And it's something that people can quite easily learn to do. It's not difficult, but it's very helpful.
Say what it is again, because I haven't heard of it either.
It's called ISP, Immediate Stabilization Procedure.
Immediate stabilization
procedure, ISP. So it's quite easy, it's not difficult to learn at all, but it's very helpful. So elements, I did mention also, I think elements of somatic experiencing, bringing yourself to the body, being aware of what comes up in the body. I think this is the essential thing here. It's not mental necessarily, cognitive, but being able to sense the body and so what happens in the body. And so then expand on that and being able to, because once you begin to observe it, that's what's incredible about it, is you begin to observe your body sensations, they begin to shift. So I really find that it's remarkable to me how effective it is. It almost seems it doesn't make sense mentally, but it should be so helpful, but it is very helpful. And then the others like safe space, I mentioned safe space or pleasant space, as we have learned.
Yes.
Safe space is not always, for elements of the body. There's another grounding technique called 4 elements. And basically, again, it's widely available on the internet. People can look it up. It's basically being able to identify the 4 elements in your body: the water, air, light, and earth. So it incorporates things I've just mentioned, right? So that there is the air as you breathe, the earth as your feet on the ground, and so on, the breath. So it's also very helpful for people. Jacobson's relaxation, where you just I prefer to call it a muscle relaxation, when you go through your body, tensing your muscles, releasing your muscles. This is just what kind of comes to me. This is things that I use quite regularly, but there are others like that. It doesn't have to be exactly that, but I think they're grounding. They're very grounding. They bring the person back to their body. And then you can do the other kinds of therapies that we are used to doing. It's not either or, it's and.
Yes, absolutely. And so from hearing from you, it sounds like really figuring out where they are in their trauma, understanding their own story, their own experience, and then meeting them where they are with the modality and with the interventions.
I would say also I think for therapists and also for people, and that is not only for therapists, we must learn the signs of traumatic responses, not just the symptoms of PTSD, but the fight, freeze responses. We must learn what they look like so then we can recognize them better, because that makes a big difference. If we can really see in the client's body, it's like being aware of the client's body. It's not just being aware of what they say and how they look, how they're emotionally responding, but how does their body look?
Right. Absolutely. I've definitely noticed a difference when I have a client come in here in high stress versus coming in here and more relaxed. I can sense it. I can feel it. So we just need to be paying attention to that, because maybe they're not saying it, but we are sensing it. So we might see something that they don't, to be able to help them too. And so similarly, what about therapists? How can they hold space for a client's trauma without becoming emotionally dysregulated themselves?
This is the very important piece. Because we are so prone, we're more likely to feel more empathetic. We're more likely to take on those feelings and those traumatic experiences that people have experienced. So what would I say that helps people to keep themselves, to be able to work, not to stay grounded? I think it's really important to stay grounded, is to be able to, first of all, notice boundaries. There's a lot that's been written about shared therapeutic reality, which is that one way, especially when you have therapists who are experience something similar to the client, that they will, there's a sense of blurring of the boundaries. And it's not always such a bad thing if we're aware of it. It's very important, I think, to be aware of it. But if you're noticing the aware of it, it's a sign also that you're much more likely to become more dysregulated as your clients. So I would say, again, your own work, your own grounding, your own self-care, your own supervision, your own therapy, also knowing what you need. Sometimes I find people can be very helpful and they start telling other people what they need. That may or may not be what you need. Focus on what you need and learn what you need. You might not need what they need. An introvert needs a bit less spending time with people than an extrovert because that's how they're set up. But I think I would say awareness is first, but then your own work, your own ground. I have a colleague, I love her for this. She actually puts appointments and help on her schedule for herself. Like you have a schedule, usually have names of her clients. No, she actually has like 2-hour windows for herself. She is the person in that slot. I think that's great. That was what a great idea, because it's not just like, oh, I will take care of myself whenever I have a break or at the end of the day or whatever. No, it's an appointment. She has an appointment with herself. I think I love that.
I think that's so great. I did something similar where I have an office manager schedules appointments for me sometimes, but I block out my own schedule with all of my own needs and lunch breaks and all that. But I had on one because I knew it was going to be kind of like a heavy morning. And so I have a 2-hour break. I think it's like next Thursday, and it says relax, meditate. And she was like, what is this appointment for? And I was like, oh, no, that's for me. Just relaxing because I know it's going to be a heavy morning. And so I'm going to be able to go off into the afternoon and give myself some space and time. But I had to tell myself to do that and remind myself that this is what you need. Don't get off at some other track. Yeah, so I love that your colleague does that as well. And so sometimes, hey, if we have too busy of a schedule, we just need to fit ourselves in our schedule and maybe we'll actually follow through.
Exactly. And as I say, I really want to encourage people, especially therapists, who are as a way of preventing that lack of dysregulation and being overwhelmed, really do learn what you need. For some people, meditation is helpful, but it's not enough. I found myself, I've been a meditator since I was 18, so many years of experience, and it's always been my lifesaver. I have to say, it's not enough now. It's not been enough. I personally need more body interventions. I need to go to the swimming pool. I literally need to lay on the earth or on the beach or go to a sauna or something like this that's very body-based. That's me. That might not be everybody. But I really want to encourage therapists to really find out what the help works for them and keep going until you find out.
Absolutely. Keep going till you find out. And that's so true. I didn't used to meditate. And then I went to a yoga meditation kind of center a few years ago. It was like a mini conference. And I really fell in love with some of the different meditations that I was learning and saw that 10 minutes every few hours can be super helpful for me in my system. But on the weekends, when I have the space and time, I live in Florida. So one of my favorite things is to go to the beach, but not just to go to the beach. It's that calms me. Being by the water is very calming to me. Having the sun is really calming to me. And so I know a couple of hours will do a complete reset for the next week. And so that's something that I strive toward. But I was always curious as to why I liked it so much. And then I kind of realized what it was doing for my system, which is why now it's more of a, you know what, I need to get there this weekend for a few hours because it's been a lot this week. And I know that it's going to help me reset. And so you're right that it's finding what's right for you. And so we can give tips and hints and different recommendations for people. I try to say it's not a one size fits all, but you do need to try certain things in order to find out what's best for you. But it is understanding what's going on in your body, learning those responses, and then trying to find your best fit for what you need. It might look different from the weekend to the weekday. It might look different at different times in your life. Like you said, higher stress times, lower stress times, those might need different things. But my next question was going to be to advice to therapists on working with refugees, immigrants, or displaced clients who carry trauma. You've given a lot of advice and suggestions, recommendations, and it sounds like it's really honestly for both recommendations for the therapists themselves, which is just as important because if we are called to be helpers, we have to make sure we're keeping ourselves well in order to do our jobs well if we want to keep doing that. And at least for me, I'll speak for myself, this career gives back to me as well. So I love what I do. I love helping other people, and it certainly gives back. And so sometimes when we burn out and then we step away from what we're called to do or what we love doing, that can also affect us. And so taking care of ourselves is so important to continue to do what we love to do, to be able to help people and to give back to ourselves. Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree 100%. I agree because I do think that many of us are called to this profession. It's not only a career in a kind of classical sense of that word that we're called to this profession. And I do think that if we really allow it, it really does change us. And so if we burn out and we step away, there's a lot for many of us, I certainly can speak for myself, but I don't think I'm only speaking for myself. There's going to be a sense of loss of meaning, a loss of real sense of soul's purpose that can be helpful.
Right, exactly. So taking care of ourselves is also taking care of ourselves in the long run too, to do what we are called to do. And so I want to kind of shift to hope and resilience for the last few minutes to give some bright lights to this because like I said in the first time, I've really enjoyed just being in your presence. You have a very light hearted, very joyful, happy presence and countenance. And so how have you seen, even just in yourself or others, how have you seen resilience shine through in individuals, even in the midst of this? And I don't want to answer the question for you, but something that I've seen in certain places, like one of the things that meant so much to me when we were all going through COVID, like this whole world kind of trauma that we all went through. And I know it's nothing like what you're experiencing. It's just one of those kind of collective experiences that we all had. I remember watching the videos where people in Italy were singing outside of their balconies as like this collection. It's like they couldn't get to each other, but that's something that they could do. And that was so special to see, to go, gosh, you know what? They're still together. They're hanging in there together. They're saying it's tough, but we're all here. And I thought, things like that were so sweet, or people offering to help people in so many different ways, getting groceries for somebody that was too afraid to leave their house. So, hey, you know what? I'll get those for you. I'll leave them outside. So that was something that was so special, I think, that I saw was this kind of collective help, or this collective, we actually do want to be together and we do care about being together and we miss that. And so in your experience with what you're going through and what your clients are going through, where have you seen resilience shine through?
Thank you for sharing those memories. I remember what you're talking about, and that it was truly very special. But I would say, joining what you said, I would say I've seen very similar things both in Israel and Ukraine, but just multiplied by 100. That level, really heightened level of help and camaraderie and sort of volunteering and helping and just being available. So that's been very much the case, I think. But I also would say that I think that what I've also seen is an incredible sort of strength of character. I think strength of character and that kind of resilience, and that gets almost like forged out of these horrible, horrible, horrible experiences, exploring experiences of facing your own death, experiences of facing fear of death of your loved one. There's something that it sometimes happens that really, not something, but this process really pushes some people into a different sort of state of their own identity, their own development, their own. As a colleague of mine just recently, she phrased it as the strength of character. Very interesting. I not thought of it like that, but I always sort of joke and say, it's not really funny, but I said nobody has done more for Ukrainian identity than Putin. Because when you're facing your own existential death, you're going to think about who you are and who you would like to be, and what does that mean, and how does that look like. And even though I'm like other people can also, there are days I feel just sort of very helpless and is there end to this and what's going to happen. But I also see this resilience, and I also see that, it's incredible. I sometimes think it's just absolutely against all odds. You can really see the resilience, the strength, the tenacity of the human spirit. And it's like a little light. It's like different lights, and you feel like you're the only light, or that person is the only light. But then, it's like you begin to echo one another. It's really rather incredible.
Yeah, that is very special. And so what does, like, as we're talking about this and kind of coming together during times of crisis, what does the global mental health solidarity mean to you? I know this is kind of a big question, but how do you feel like therapists around the world can stand with one another during times of crisis? I kind of shared with you a little bit. That's one reason why I started this podcast, was to really bring voices from around the world together so that we can find our connections versus our differences and say, hey, what are you doing over here in your country, in your area? What are you doing to help people? What modalities? What are you seeing as far as struggles? And how do you take care of yourself? And are there things that we can learn from you and things that you can learn from us? And so that was kind of the part of the entirety of the podcast. And so for you and your experience, how do you feel like therapists stand together around the world?
I suppose I feel, from my point of view, and I know there are many dimensions to that question, but I would say being able to offer compassion, being able to offer empathy, being able to offer understanding or interest rather than judgment and all kinds of political opinions. Be curious. I think I would love, for me, this would look like curiosity also, that therapists would be curious about other people, other therapist experience, rather than immediately projecting what they think about various situations. And also having also humility that we may not know everything about everything, and we may not understand certain experiences and how history of trauma impacts current experiences. And I find that particularly sometimes it will be the case that people don't always understand. Like theoretically they understand, but don't really understand what that looks like. And so that having the curiosity, having that humility that we may not know everything. Nobody knows everything, We're always learning. I think this is an amazing part of our profession, is that no matter how many years you've been in the field, you're always learning something. There's no
Always learning. I say that all the time.
Yes. And people are so inclined. They can offer support. They can offer space to talk. They can offer. I remember a colleague of mine, soon after there were 7 massacres here, had reached out and offered me a session at EMDR. And at first I thought of like, but we're colleagues, like this is going to work. But it does work with EMDR because it is more of a protocol rather than, an in-depth therapeutic experience. And it did help. And it was very touching that she cared enough to do that. And it was very helpful. And I've seen that also in Ukraine when I offer my time in the pro bono basis in many cases, that I know that people feel that if somebody is willing to do that and willing to reach out, that there is not. A colleague of mine said that in Ukraine it was very touching. She said, well, then not everything is lost. Yeah, I think there's a wide range of possibilities of therapists to do that if they want to, if they really want to feel that connection and to be available to others.
Yeah, so stay curious, stay humble. We don't know everything and what people are experiencing. Offer support where we can, or just have conversations and hear people listen. Like these conversations I'm having with you, I really appreciate so much your time that you've given 2 times, for the podcast and sharing your voice and your experience. I think it's really powerful and it's really important. And I hope that people take so much of what you said and really put it into place in their life, whether it's just more of an understanding, compassion, curiosity. I think there's so many things that people can take from them just from listening today. And so what final message would you like to share with the listeners? It could be therapists, it could be survivors, it could be people that are currently experiencing this. The podcast is really being listened to around the world. So we don't know where people are listening from, but I do know that it's definitely an internationally listened to podcast. So what would you share with people as your final message today?
I want to, some of it may sound very simple, but I've really thought a lot about this, throughout these years. What are these things that can hold us, that we can grab onto when we feel powerless in the face of war? And this is something that I faced since the beginning of war in Ukraine, continued to with what's happening in Israel. It may feel like when you feel alone, it's going to sound like blah, 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 blah. But we're not alone. We feel like we're alone, but we're not alone. Sometimes when we're so impacted by a lot of loud voices on the media or in various spaces, and we think that's the only voice that's out there. But I don't think that's true. I really, really don't believe that's true. And so we're not alone. And there are others who are there are others who are helping. But even though we can feel alone, but we may not be alone. I really want to say that. And the second thing I want to say is that we got to keep going. And I have to take that my own advice too. Sometimes I feel like, why is this? Does this make sense? What is this? What am I doing? But I do think we have to keep going. And when I think of that, what always comes to my mind is the quote by William Blake, the famous quote, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in the hour. It always comes back to me in these moments because I feel like it just reminds us to be able to see the world in a grain of sand, to be able to see the whole world in one human being. It's not for nothing, I think, that in Talmud and I think in other religious sources says that if you save one person, you save the whole world. Because each one of us is a whole world, really. And to see that impact and that you matter because you're the whole world, and somebody else that you're facing, that you're helping or you are in contact with, and you might have just uplifted someone because you smiled at them. And they're also their own world, and that you matter and that your impact matters.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that everybody, I think that's so important. I'm just kind of reflecting on that because I think that we should see ourselves as more of a collective. Like, what can I do even just for the person next to me? How can I help? How can I see them? How can I hear them? How can I be there for them? As opposed to this individualistic, and we're not alone. And I think that that's a good thing. And I hope that people take comfort in that, and that people are there like you that want to be there with them. So if they are feeling that way, they can reach out, because there are plenty of people saying, hey, you know what? I want to be here for you. I want to listen to you. I want to be the person that walks with you on this journey.
Yeah. But it's the opposite of indifference.
Yes.
And I always say that to people, don't be so different, but that's the opposite of that, what we're saying here.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining me again. Thank you for your time. Such an incredible conversation. And as a listener, I hope that you found some insights to take with you. Remember, no matter where you are in the world or where you're coming from, your mental wellness truly, truly matters. So be patient with yourself, take time for your well-being, and never forget that seeking help is a sign of strength. Thank you again for joining us. And I look forward to connecting with you next time on Mental Health Without Borders.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share, to have this really interesting conversation with you. So thank you very much. Your dedication to mental health across borders, on the international mental health.
Yes, international mental health. Thank you so much.